Optimize your nutrition this year with Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal service. Factor's fresh, never-frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from 40 weekly options across 8 dietary preferences, like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Eat smarter at factormeals.com/listen50 and use code LISTEN50 for 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Factormeals.com/listen50, code LISTEN50.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I saw that documentary as well. I've referred to Native Americans as sort of an invisible race in this country. You always see some poll, some pie chart on the news. It's like, Blacks, Hispanics, Asian, and then other, and we never get our own category, our own statistic. And we are sort of invisible to most Americans. And I was shocked when I was young. I went to visit my relatives in Tennessee where my dad grew up, and they couldn't believe that they were talking to a Native American. They were just like, I didn't know there was any more Native Americans left. They're like, that's so great. I'm like, well, isn't that great? I was like, oh my gosh. There's people who don't believe that we're still here. And, certainly the media and the news overlooks us. It just depends, I guess, what part of the country you live in. But yeah, the documentary was a little troubling, especially since we have such large reservations. The largest land-based reservations in the state of California are in Humboldt County, and there are tons of issues with marijuana growing on the reservations. So, the fact that they didn't devote part of an episode to going up to, Hoopa to talk to people, they missed an opportunity there to, I think, explore something that's pretty interesting that really, to my knowledge, really hasn't been explored in terms of how does that affect missing people or crime or, things of that nature.
That's Victorio Shaw, a tribal judge in California. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. This is the second of 2 episodes with Judge Shaw. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the first one, I suggest you jump back and listen. In that episode, we discussed Humboldt County, California, a sprawling mountainous county in Northern California that runs along the coast. It's known for a wide variety of things related to its remoteness, including the place where Bigfoot was coined in 1958 after large footprints, later found to be fabricated, were attributed to a Sasquatch in the southern part of the county. It's also the home to Murder Mountain, which took its name in the 1980s from 2 serial killers who were there. Murder Mountain is also the name of a 2018 documentary on the marijuana industry and numerous murders and disappearances. One thing, however, that Murder Mountain doesn't cover and that we discuss are the reservations and the natives within Humboldt County who make up 1 out of every 5 missing and murdered Indigenous person in the state of California. What Murder Mountain doesn't capture is the reality that exists in a place like this. Humboldt County is probably among the highest in terms of the rate of missing people, but it doesn't touch on many reservations that cross its lands and the many challenges there. Judge Shaw, who's a member of the Hoopa tribe, grew up on a reservation here. Now he presides as the chief judge of a tribal court for a different tribe. And we talk about both the legal issues, the behavioral health, the mental health issues. We talk about many of the topics that relate to the challenges and also the beauties that exist in places like these. In this conversation, we dive deeper into some of those topics and what we can do in particular to start conversations, even if they're coming from an uncomfortable place, to get to know each other and find our commonalities and find a better way. We also talk about what we can find and what we can learn from Native and other cultures that have experienced suffering. Their resilience, their strength is something, as we talk about, that we should all be proud of.
I think it's important to, we talked about the downside potentially of gaming. The upside is, money is not inherently evil. It's stored energy. It's a resource. So if tribes can master their own opportunities and utilize these resources, they can have a tremendous impact on the well-being of their people across the board, not just their pockets, but their mental health, their physical health. And so the tribe I work for devotes a tremendous amount of resources to their tribal services department that gets the tribal members the help they need. And it's customized to each tribal member. They'll do all the hand-holding. They'll take them to the appointments. They'll come to their house. They'll get the larger family involved. It's a really tremendous model, and I'm really proud to be part of that process through the court, where I sit as judge, and enabling the people to do this work. And it works because you have qualified, dedicated people. There's not a ton of turnover, so that trust relationship between the service providers and the tribal members can build and grow. And you have tribal members at key positions within the tribal services department, including the director, who can really get into each case and customize a wellness, a treatment plan for each individual that will actually produce results.
Right. And that level of, so when you think of a spot like going back home to the reservation where you grew up, it's not sort of like, from your perspective, a desire or a will, because I think that's one of the misconceptions, and this is something that people don't like to talk about. And I can apply this to Black communities too, that there's this perception that people have, however wrong-headed, that this is a issue of will, a desire. But I remind people, like, we can't like conjure up opportunity. We can't conjure up support. That there's something that happens over time in communities that go, I think, a long time without these support systems. Like, hope starts to disappear. I think.
Oh, totally. There's not a lot of hope on my reservation, unfortunately, when it comes to these, drug addiction, behavioral health, and there shouldn't be, because it's not getting any better. It hasn't gotten any better. It continues to be an epidemic on our reservation. So there's not really a lot of cause for hope, unless an individual, decides and has a good family that's willing to help them, and they sort of find maybe a cultural path to wellness. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of ways for people to get out of these cycles. But, conversely, seeing a tribe who is doing a good job, however, on a much smaller basis, it really is attributable directly to the leadership of the tribe.
Right.
Of them saying, this is our priority. They could easily spend that money in a million other places. They could golf course, or they could, whatever. But they put their money where their mouth is. And not only, they don't just throw money at the problem, they stay personally involved in these cases, into these individuals' wellness path, because these are their relatives. These are their cousins, their nephews, their brothers and sisters. And you see it. You see it in the decision making, in the care, the love, the importance that they put on these things is communicated throughout all the departments that work for the tribe. It's a top-down philosophy, and everyone that works there picks up on it and wants to be part of it. And
it sort of spreads. Right. Yeah. And it becomes like, probably, I imagine, more of something that you can take pride in. Because I was just thinking about a case like Emilee's, and so many more that we've heard of missing and murdered Indigenous people, that it almost feels as if, we talk a lot, I think a lot more about how law enforcement and the criminal justice system and jurisdictional issues fail them once they go missing or when they're murdered. But it's almost like they're failed in life sometimes by not having the support that we would expect in most American communities. And then they're failed again with the second piece. And, as somebody who's a part of the legal system, I think one of the things that just seems to be a challenge from my perspective is, I think the legal boundaries, the jurisdictional issues and I know the systems are different on different reservations. Could you talk a little bit about how some of those legal complications get in the way from sort of like a criminal justice and just the getting justice for people, or even preventing things like domestic violence or other issues like that?
Yeah. Like you said, it's definitely different from tribe to tribe. Population, geography, resources are all going to be key factors. Jurisdictionally, in states like California, where I am, it's a public law 280 state, which means that the state law enforcement is essentially who enforces criminal laws on the reservation. And it probably wouldn't surprise most people to learn that oftentimes what happens on tribal reservations is not the priority of the state law enforcement. Okay, the county sheriff, and to their credit, they have a lot to deal with, right? They might be underfunded in general. So when they're prioritizing what to pursue, what to do, the reservation is going to be probably the most difficult thing to police. It's the farthest away. They're the least familiar with it. It's very rural. People can hide, people can go missing. And then there's just a lot more issues per capita. And so what sheriff's departments do is they make, they sort of they have to prioritize what they're going to do. And most of the time, the tribe's issues end up at the bottom of their list. And this could be for many reasons, including, prejudice, but also the fact that the state can't tax the tribes. So there might be some amount of resentment that from the law enforcement that they have to go deal with these tribes. Why can't the tribes take care of it? Not understanding that Congress removed that ability from the tribes to take care of it themselves. And so there's a lot of, even within law enforcement, misunderstanding of the law.
Right.
It's their duty, Congress said this is your duty to police this, and Congress really doesn't give them extra funding to do it. And if the tribe doesn't have resources, the tribe can't provide that funding. In some instances where tribes do have resources, they might have significantly better response, from local law enforcement in terms of responding to calls, which in my experience, they do.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
So tribes can enforce criminal law against non-natives on the reservation, meaning they can't arrest, try, and punish. So they can, if they come across a non-native person on the reservation, breaking a state crime, committing a crime that would be a crime in California, they can detain that person. They can call the sheriff, and the sheriff will come out and make a determination on whether to arrest that person, to cite them, and then the district attorney's office is going to evaluate the case and decide if they want to pick up the case and prosecute this person. So oftentimes, if the law enforcement even comes out, they might decline to arrest the person. They'll just take them off. They'll just take them off the tribal lands and drop them off at the bus stop or something.
Oh, wow.
And then that person's like, well, I can go there.
Turn around and go right back and
Yeah.
commit crimes.
And that happens all the time. Or they get arrested and the district attorney is like, I don't want to prosecute that. That's not, that's just not a fun case, or it's a burden, or I don't care. And so maybe they get arrested, but they don't get prosecuted. So similar thing, they're like, okay, well, I guess I can get away with stuff up there. And it incentivizes people.
It reminds me, like a military guy told me this. He was like a special forces guy. He's like, so, what we always look for, he said, was like when we're doing work overseas, is what is the most permissive environment? Meaning, where can we insert ourselves, roam around, and there's not going to be resistance? And when you say that, it's almost like the system makes reservations in many cases the most permissive environment for criminals. I was given an example when I was visiting the Millex band of the Ojibwe tribe he gave me the example, and he was saying, so years before, because it's a relatively recent decision that even allows tribal police officers to detain people. But he said, if you were dating someone on the reservation and you committed domestic violence against them as a non-native, he said, all I could do is detain you until the Minnesota State Police get here. Before then, he's like, I get the call, I find out you're non-native, then I have to call the Minnesota police to get you, and you're gone by then. And then, we have to wait and then report you again when you're seen. And a system like that, I think for somebody who wants to do something nefarious, is like, you might as well put a sign on the door that says, hey, non-natives, please come here and commit crimes. But I'm sure it's not just non-natives, it's also natives, but it's kind of putting two different kinds of signs on the door saying, come here and commit crimes.
Yeah, I wish I had the statistic in front of me, but there's an alarming percentage of cases that don't get picked up on that happen on reservations. And that's by the federal government in those states where it's the federal government's duty to prosecute those cases, and the same on the state. So the percentage of those cases that actually get prosecuted is much lower when the same crime happens on the reservation versus off the reservation.
Wow. So and you mentioned confusion. I remember hearing this story, and this one's out of Montana, actually, at the Blackfeet Reservation, where even the Bureau of Indian Affairs police officers were confused about their ability to arrest. That the confusion's so bad that the people who are experts, should be the experts in this, don't really know what to do. Yeah, can you think of sort of like a better way to sort of approach these issues, or a more uniform way, or a way to incentivize people?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the training that law enforcement officers are required to go through, in order to become, a sheriff or sheriff's deputy, that there's little to no education about how to police the reservations. And that piece alone should take at least a minimum of a week, and they probably get about 2 hours on it. And so you get these cadets, they come up they get called up to the casino because, someone got caught with fentanyl, and they're saying, this guy's got fentanyl and scales. And they'll ask the tribal police, well, does that mean we were supposed to arrest them? Those conversations actually happen because they haven't been trained on how to police the reservation in California, where there's over 100 tribes. So, first of all, there needs to be significantly better training required of individuals who are going through administration of justice programs in each state. And then there needs to be re-education once they get into the police force, training, education on the protocols, on the laws. And, there's plenty of tribes and tribal attorneys and professors who would be more than happy to participate in these trainings and come directly to the sheriff's department and provide these types of things. So it's not like, we're screaming as the tribal attorneys, educators, and judges, like, please let us come and tell you our perspective and provide some training on this. And it's really up to each individual, city or county on whether or not they want their officers to spend time learning about it.
Yeah. So, that reminds me of, I spoke with a woman who, an Alaskan Native woman. She had actually, traveled out and done work in DC and other places in Colorado in public policy, then came back to her tribe in Alaska. And she was a part of a lobbying effort. And they were able, it was very interesting. So they somehow, I think, ended up getting a meeting with the state superintendent of police, which I think they call the Department of Public Safety in Alaska, and they showed the numbers on missing Indigenous people, domestic violence within the tribes, and the superintendent was shocked at the numbers. So what he voluntarily did was he created an office where he, I think, put, like, I'm making up the number now, but it was like 2 or 3 investigators, just focused on those cases. And after a couple months, he was like, okay, 2 or 3 is not going to do it. And he put more investigators. And then they eventually actually created a unit, by the legislature created a unit to focus on those cases. But one of the really cool things that they did, to your point about education, was they wrote into the law a provision that said, to become a police officer in the state of Alaska, number 1, you need to have this certain minimum education. Number 2, you need to have X, Y, or Z law enforcement training. Number 3, you need to have this amount of training in Indigenous cultures and and related issues, law and culture. And it's actually a very long program that anyone who wants to be a police officer in Alaska now has to go through. And one of the interesting things about that conversation was seeing the real change that's happened from that. And one of the things that she said, one of the biggest changes is the ability of the police officers to develop relationships with the tribal leaders, formal and informal ones, and to create scenarios where people feel comfortable engaging with even law enforcement. Because we were talking about all those things, all those policies that are created that really, 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 really have harmed communities. There's got to be a sense of mistrust in general, which also plays a role in it. Is that fair?
Oh, completely. Yeah, it's like the Grand Canyon. The amount of the tribes and law enforcement, as far as trust goes, there's a canyon in between them, historically, because the police were at one point our oppressors, our captors. And we haven't seen good results from police interactions, from enforcement of protective orders, unfortunately, from prosecutions, arrests. There's very little trust in general on reservations when it comes to law enforcement. And I would say that's why tribes that have tribal police, it helps a lot, because the tribal police are educated in the tribe and respectful of traditions and customs and the history, and they get to know people on a first name basis. Like our tribal police, he said, we try to be more like Andy Griffith. We want to know everyone. Like, we'll take you home instead of, arresting you or citing you or calling the sheriff. But yeah, there's this historical mistrust completely about really any authority, whether any government authority and Indian people. So that's why a lot of tribes have turned to tribal police as a remedy for keeping their people safe. And it actually works quite well, if a tribe has the resources.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, yeah, and then just sort of thinking about that element of it, a combination of the two, right? Like empowering the tribes, having those relationships with, tribal police, educating the other folks who need to support this. But I imagine at some point there's got to be a hope for the law to change to give tribes a little bit more power over their legal system? Or do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And I think there is more hope than there ever has been. I think we are getting better results, at least in our state, in terms of getting laws passed that help tribes protect themselves, that are slowly bolstering tribal law enforcement's ability to do their job. And so it's trending up. It's trending in the right direction. Here in California, we really have to make tiny baby steps when we're talking about changes in the law. It would be great to just sort of make one big change and rectify a lot of this, issues that we have. But we're patient. We're being patient. Slowly but surely, we're getting more access to the criminal databases. We're getting recognition of our protection orders, and there's more grants available federally for tribal law enforcement. So these things are all helping. One of the other things that helps is tribes going out to the county, to law enforcement, and working with them, coming together, creating a memorandum of understanding about how how law is going to be enforced on their reservation. What happens when we call the sheriffs to come arrest someone? What's the protocol? What can both sides expect? And the tribe, Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, I think, has one of the best relationships with the county in which their reservation resides that I've seen in California. And it's taken a lot of time. There's a lot of trust building. There's the tribe committing a lot of resources to the county, which helps, obviously, so that we being me and my court and the law enforcement, we actually get very good response in general from the county at most levels. I mean, there's still a lot of work that can be done. But tribes and counties can really work together. They don't have to wait for the federal government or the state. They can,
or a law, right?
Yeah,
right.
Because we're a sovereign government as a tribal government, and we can have a government to government relationship with not only the federal government, the state, but also the counties and the cities that are our neighbors. And so I am a big advocate of tribes, reaching out to the county, finding common ground, leveraging the resources of the tribe to take stuff off the plate of the county and doing it at a high level. And then that, begets more sharing of information, of resources, of responsibilities, and provides a greater overall level of, not just safety, security on the reservation, but also just a harmonious working relationship between the tribe and the county.
Yeah, one heartening thing for me, even though I know the results have been mixed, but has been seeing, I think, more Supreme Court decisions, U.S. Supreme Court decisions that are respecting treaties and tribal sovereignty. And it's not like we're not batting 10 for 10 or whatever it is, but there have been some, at least there's a voice there now. Say what you will about Neil Gorsuch, but at least there's a strong voice making the case. But I wonder, because, intertwined with sovereignty is also the United States government has made promises in terms of taking responsibility for some things. And I think we don't, and I say this as like stepping outside of my, as a non-native, speaking for, I don't think we as a country do a good job of that always. And some of that obviously is driven by the exact things that you're saying. Like, when you have a smaller population or a smaller tax base, you're not necessarily, or your tax contribution, you're not getting the same attention. But I think some of it is this systematic othering where it's almost like we can drive right by other people and we don't really see them.
Yeah.
And I was watching this documentary. It's a very popular true crime documentary, and it's called Murder Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that stuck out to me, it's about Humboldt County. According to the documentary, they say they have the highest per capita missing persons rate of any county in the United States, although I'm not entirely sure that's true. But but I ran some numbers, and I think there's some unincorporated parts of Alaska that may have higher rates. But it was fascinating to me because in the documentary, they go into the marijuana trade there, they go into drugs and the remoteness of the area, but they did not focus in a county with so many missing people and the highest rate of missing people. They didn't really focus on the missing and murdered natives and how that was contributing to the numbers. Humboldt County makes up, I think I had read that it's a greater percentage of the missing person cases than certainly any county in California. And, but it also makes up 1 out of every 5 missing Indigenous people in California. And that wasn't the focus. And I sort of looked at that and I viewed that as like, I was telling a friend as I was watching it, I was like, every second of this where they're not saying the word Indigenous, I'm getting angrier and angrier. I can't really enjoy it. But I just thought it was a metaphor for how you go to a county because of its problems with missing people and don't focus on the Indigenous people who are there. And I think there's this othering where we just don't see sometimes, and I don't know how to solve for that.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I saw that documentary as well. I've referred to Native Americans as sort of an invisible race in this country. You always see some poll, some pie chart on the news. It's like, blacks, Hispanics, Asian, and then other, we never get our own category, our own statistic. And we are sort of invisible to most Americans. And I was shocked when I was young. I went to visit my relatives in Tennessee where my dad grew up, and they couldn't believe that they were talking to a Native American. They were just like, I didn't know there was any more Native Americans left. They're like, that's
wow.
so great. I'm like, well, isn't that great? I was like, oh my gosh. There's people who don't believe that we're still here. And, certainly the media and the news overlooks us. It just depends, I guess, what part of the country you live in. But yeah, the documentary was a little troubling, especially since we have such large reservations. The largest land-based reservations in the state of California are in Humboldt County, and there are tons of issues with marijuana growing on the reservations. So, the fact that they didn't devote part of an episode to going up to, Hoopa to talk to people, they missed an opportunity there to, I think, explore something that's pretty interesting that really, to my knowledge, really hasn't been explored in terms of how does that affect missing people or crime or, things of that nature. Although, everything has changed since quote unquote legalization. But, there's a long history of marijuana being grown on Indian land all over the country, really.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny you bring up the legalization point. One of the things about legalization that's really fascinating to me is it's actually probably in a weird way grown the black market as legal marijuana has become regulated more and taxed at a higher rate of other things. A lot of what, the open folks may have side businesses in the black market, but it's pushed prices down. So people who can't afford to meet all the regulatory requirements and the tax requirements are going back to the black market. And it just reminds me of all those like unintended consequences, at least for, it may have been a lot of those things that oppressed Indigenous people in the US may have been intentional by some people, but for many of us who thought they were good things, they ended up being unintentional consequences. And you're right, Ed, I think there is a huge missed opportunity. And when I think about it, I think about that example you gave of your relatives being in awe that that natives were still around. I think on some levels, I think all of us need to make an effort, whether you're native, whether you're black, whether you're white, to go into spaces that are unfamiliar for us. And because I think what you realize when you do that, and I remember this moment when I was a reporter, I was young, I got this assignment for the Boston Globe where I had to cover Confederate monuments. So this is like in the early 90s. And I had to write about, why people wanted to protect Confederate monuments. And I found in Virginia the head of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And I was talking to him on the phone and, just interviewing him like any other story. But by the end of it, he's in tears because I asked him questions and I explained how it kind of felt, like the whole Confederate monument. He's in tears and he's telling me how, he grew up in rural Virginia. The first time he was ever exposed to Black people was when he saw the riots in 67 on TV. And I thought, wow, like there's a moment where you not being exposed created this fear for you, and me not being exposed to you, I had this giant fear about you. And that if we can sit down at the table together, I think it's a little easier to see each other as humans and a little harder to ignore what's happening. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest problems that prevents us from healing as a country is not engaging in that exact type of conversation. There's a man, I want to credit him. Let me look at his name, Mark Charles. I don't know if you've ever seen Mark Charles speak.
No.
He talks a lot about the doctrine of discovery, and he talks about generational trauma. And one of the overlooked parts about generational trauma is that the person who commits the act also receives trauma.
Yes.
And the victim. And so we have a country with all of this unresolved trauma because we refuse to talk about these sensitive issues, whether it's, the taking of this country and the genocide of the natives, whether it's slavery, whether it's the treatment of other, peoples, that instead of talking about it, we replace that conversation with, blind nationalism, or at least that was.
Yeah. This notion of American exceptionalism.
Exactly.
Yeah. And we don't even talk about like taking it even away from something that's racial. Like we don't talk about Appalachia. We don't talk about domestic violence. We don't talk about all these real things that happen to people. And I think that's a really astute point, by the way. I remember recently talking to somebody about a murder case, and it was a guy who was charged with, and he's now been convicted of murdering 2 young girls in Indiana. And someone asked me, why is he reacting this way as like news pretrial stuff about his behaviors? I said, I think the thing that you're forgetting is that the perpetrator experiences trauma too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, there's a lot of healing that needs to happen.
Yeah. And it begins by just sitting down and talking about these things and realizing that we have so much more in common than we do, not in common.
I agree. That was an interesting conversation because once again, it never goes where I expect it to go. But I think in some ways, as somebody who's straddled these 2 worlds and sees opportunity, opportunity for all of us to sort of sit down together, opportunity for us to coordinate together, opportunity for us to sort of collectively as humanity, right, support each other. What is sort of in thinking about your lifetime and sort of like imagining yourself like your aunt in your 90s, let's say you at 96, what are your kind of hopes and dreams in terms of where we could get?
Wow, that's a heavy question. Yeah, it's hard because I don't allow myself to look that far ahead sometimes, as I'm so embroiled in all of the things there are to work on. I guess my hope is that people will have learned how to heal, and so we're not passing on all of our trauma and our addiction to our children. and that eventually Indian people can get out of this fight or flight place that we've sort of been stuck in for the last 200 years and really build for the future, for a sustainable way of life for Indian people that is not just separate from the rest of the country, but also is seen as an asset, as seen as something that all Americans can be proud of.
I'll tell you, I am. Like my journey, I remember the first time I did work with Native students, I was like a young journalist. This was very early in my career, and I was exposed. One of my friends who is Native and also a reporter took me out to Buffalo where they were having the convention for Native American journalists, and such amazing kids, and watching them grow up, I take pride in them. When I see like the example of my friend who's a Native, who's a therapist, or I have a friend who's like running for a tribal council, like I take pride in those people as humans who, like me, walk this earth and are trying to, what I like to say is suffer better.
Yeah.
Right? But, you know, when I sit at night and I think of Native people that I know, I, I sit in amazement and I sit in pride as another human, and I sit and think of those moments that are difficult for me and think, wow, you know, these people are amazing and they've made it through this, or they've contributed this on an individual basis. So at least, you know, if that is your goal for you all to take pride, I just wanted to say that I take pride. It's not that I'm just proud of you all. I take pride as a fellow human in your resilience and what you've been able to accomplish. And I hope for that same better way.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you and to talk to you. It was a real delight.
And I'm sure it will not be the last time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up now. And I look forward to, you know, on my journeys to California or your journey somewhere else to sit down and maybe break bread together.
Would love that. Yeah, anytime. Let me know.
Thanks for joining us for the second of 2 episodes with Judge Victorio Shaw. If you're interested in learning more about the beauties and the struggles of Indigenous communities, go to our website or Patreon, where you can click on tags that will take you to our collections of episodes on these important topics. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For those of you who are interested in true crime, you can check out our new publication, The True Crime Times, on Substack. For deeper conversations with our guests, live conversations with other listeners, and to support the podcast and get early and ad-free episodes, you can also join our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again soon.